Next up, we're going to have Alex give a quick talk on, I think, what he's working on right now.
Were you writing code for it right now?
Well, I'm mostly just finishing slides right now, but maybe half hour ago, working on this code. This portion, this sort of lightning talk component of what I'm going to be talking about tonight doesn't actually have any slides, so bear with me as I look through the various discourse threads and little example things. But basically, I got a nice little introductory slide with my picture and title and background and credentials and all this stuff. I had the nickname Mr. Router because I did all this routing stuff since like Ember RC6 or so, and it basically did a lot of work for making the router way better at being able to handle lots of complex async, really leveraging promises to kind of, I don't know, basically seal-proof your app and actually adhere to some nice patterns rather than some sort of like rightward shifting callback approach, which is actually pretty hard to seal-proof in your app. So a lot of that was pretty crucial toward making this kind of, the router, the new, whatever. There's new router, there's new router, new router, all these different ones. But there's basically a major shift, like, I don't know, 8 months ago that that basically went in favor of a really nice routing API or DSL to pretty much sketch out all the different routes in your app in a pretty sensible, easy to reason about manner, but it kind of took away some of this functionality. So anyway, Facelift stuff, as it was codenamed, all that router stuff that I worked on, still has had like a few areas that have some room for improvement, and that's kind of what I've been working on the last few days. And in short, has anyone here used a thing called loading route? Show of hands. One show of hands. 2,
Yeah.
1.5 shows of hands. It is actually one of these things that kind of is somewhat intentionally left undocumented because we never felt that great about it. Some of the people that came and actually dug into the code and realized that we weren't talking about this thing that actually sort of kind of worked, maybe-ish, went ahead and wrote documentation for it, but it was never really a lovely, well ironed out solution. So what I've been working on is this concept of nested loading states, and based on some of Chris's suggestions, Chris Selden, the other Ember core member in the audience, I've extended this to these error substates. And just to give you a quick demo of what this actually means and why it's cool, this is actually live code. Most of the stuff in the pull request is done. I just have a little bit more work to do before it's actually ready. But here's the JS bin that sort of displays what's going on. So when I refresh it, I just have this, let's see here, just to show you what the code looks like. Say app router map, and there is, at the top level, there's a foo route, and it has a child bar route, and there's a child woot route. And this page that I'm refreshing is basically going to land, is going to try to initialize the app landing in this little nested route here. But I've made it such that every one of these routes that loads along the way is going to try to load this kind of faked out, fake Ajax-y sort of thing. Just it returns a promise that takes 0.6 seconds to actually fulfill. And what this is doing along the way is, because all these things, if you look at the templates that I provided for this little JS bin, I've defined a loading template, a foo/loading template, and a bar/loading template. And because all these things exist, when the promise is encountered, returned from each of these little routes that is going to be entered at the beginning, it is going to enter this loading state. And when that promise loads, it's going to continue onward to that destination route. And then when it finds the next promise that has a corresponding loading state, enter into that. And that is what is basically causing this sort of waterfall, like foo loading, bar loading, woot, and then it's finally done, that you see here. And that is something that is really, if you were to try to hardwire a way to get that working, I doubt you'd actually get it able to work. It's one of these things where we really needed some kind of first-class support in Ember itself for you to be able to do that. And one of the things that we've paid a lot of attention to is to, I mean, Ember is very opinionated, but what one of the goals is for pretty much any API feature that we're adding is to basically make anything that we add sort of easily overrideable and not really give you defaults that you can't easily just customize yourself. So at the root of this, if you're going to start using this stuff once it merges in, which I hope will be in the next few days because we're trying to make it for the next sort of beta pass, the one thing to know is that each of these loading states, which kind of get entered again because I've created these templates and given them the proper names that it's going to look for, these are actually just driven by these events, these actions, I guess is the name to use, that get fired upon your routes. And so for instance, when a promise is encountered that doesn't immediately resolve, from that route that, actually this is going to be, I'm not sure how recent the code is on here. Let's see here, just one sec. I'll figure out the best way to do this. So if you return from this model hook, which is the hook that it gets called to basically say when you enter this route, what data is going to get loaded into the controller. If a promise is returned from that, that takes a little bit of time to actually resolve. It's going to fire this loading event, or this loading action. It's kind of a weird name for it, but it's going to fire it from that route upward. And if you don't override that loading action in any way, or loading event, it's going to do this sort of default logic of looking for the template or looking for a loading route that's named what it looks for. But if you don't like that behavior, you can, one, just not define this loading route or loading template. But at its root, it's just an event that you can override. So if I wanted to, instead of going into this foo loading template or this top level loading template, I could just say actions and listen out for this loading event that's going to fire. And I don't know, just make it print out some stupid message. So when I go to this thing again, or what is it, 1427, it says OMG loading. Well, I guess it did it for all of these. Did I do it twice? This is an old version of the code. I think I fixed some stuff that's weird about it. But anyway, this is true for loading events. This is true for error events as well. So for instance, if instead of right now I just have this promise that takes 0.6 seconds to fulfill, and eventually that's the data gets returned and loaded to the controller. If this were, for instance, like an AJAX request, which jQuery promise or jQuery AJAX requests return promises, which also have their caveats of how they're a little weird sometimes. But if, for instance, you returned, I don't know, $get JSON and it was to a URL that didn't exist, or for whatever for whatever reason the server couldn't send you a response, then it would fire an error event, which has pretty much exactly the same kind of semantics as what happens with the loading event. It's something that at any point you can override and say, okay, when an error happens, resolving the model for this route, do this sort of thing. But if you haven't overridden that default behavior, it's going to do the same sort of thing where it looks for a loading template at that appropriate level of nesting. And if it finds one, it's going to render it it's going to transition into that little kind of error substate. So first off, I guess if I could get just like a nod of understanding, did that make sense, everything I just talked about? It's pretty tricky to do anything like that without having this stuff in place, and hopefully those are useful questions.
Just this basic question about the flow of the route. So you go directly to foo bar root, right?
Yeah, that's...
So if I interpret it correctly, when you navigate that to in the address bar, what's actually happening is first it goes to foo, then it transitions to route, and then bar, and then it transitions to loop, correct? Is that how the behavior works, or is it the other way around?
Well, it's tricky. It's a little tricky to think about. Basically, one of the things that the Facelift router stuff that I did, 4 months ago, one of the things that it did to kind of make the async crazy stuff that can happen when trying to enter a loading route, one of the things that it espoused or whatever was this idea of when you're trying to enter a route, when you say transition to foo, bar, woot, or whatever it is, it doesn't actually change the the route hierarchy or anything like that until all of the data for all the routes that you're going to be entering has been loaded. So it's like if you've previously, before any of this like loading substate stuff, if you try to navigate to a route and you just had some promise or whatever, get JSON that just took like 3 seconds to load, the router just thinks of it in its original state, of wherever it was before you tried to transition to, and then when that data finally came in, one giant kick into the new hierarchy. So the only thing that's different here is this concept of like a kind of like intermediate transition.
It's
So
waiting for the other pieces to
yeah.
finish.
And because it finds this nested loading state, at that point it's going to sort of do this intermediate transition into like foo/loading.
Essentially, you're waiting for the foo and bar, the various promises to resolve themselves before the final one resolves.
Yeah. Yeah.
What is that behavior, like going to it in the address bar versus say doing a link to that foo.bar.woo
Mhm.
route? Are those the same behavior?
Yes. Oh, of course.
Okay.
I have this in an example. So we're using link tos here just for index and foo. Well, let me go back to my old example. This is just too annoying. Let me get rid of this thing here. I don't know why it was alerting twice. That's either a bug in that original old code or that's something I'm not noticing here. But so if you go to index and then you say foo bar woo, same sort of thing happens. It's not, because loading route isn't this thing. So basically, loading route was a thing that existed before all this work that I did, but it's this weird sort of transient, not really existing in the sort of state machiney portion of the router. It was like this kind of like modally sort of template that got rendered onto the screen that if you really wanted to, anytime that a promise was returned in the middle of a transition, you could just like put up a big blurb over your app that said loading. It was really not very useful. The actions that you would have fired on it if you like clicked on something on the loading route went to kind of all the wrong places, and it was hard to actually do anything useful with it. So this would definitely give you, a little bit, well, a lot more power really to handle this kind of stuff. I might have seen sort of flourishes of other hand-raising-ish stuff. Are there any more questions on this?
Can you demonstrate what happens if, say, bar or foo fails?
If bar or foo fails?
Yeah,
Sure.
yeah.
So if I make, so hopefully this will be, both this and the presentation will be getting a little bit is I'm trying to keep it decently code heavy because it's one thing to talk about these things and others to actually see it working. So I'll happily deal with any of these as you want. Let's see here. So if we're just going to pretend that something went wrong. Let's see. So what happens here? Okay. So I'll refresh this. And it gets stuck on loading child of bar because, well, the last promise that we're returning this on the leaf route is throwing an error. Presently, unless you override some defaults, it's just going to kind of just blurt out this message, this console log or whatever, this console assert, and tell you like sort of went wrong. At least give you a starting point of what went wrong. It's not actually going to go into a error state until I go ahead and define an error state. So for instance, if it's this thing here, bar root route here corresponds to the route that'll get the route object that'll get materialized for this thing. If this throws an error, and it's basically going to look for a kind of sibling error route, as if you had done something like this and then transitioned into that. But you don't actually have to explicitly do that. What you can do is just say, copy this thing here. I think this will work. And again, I forget which version of this JS bin's on, so it might be a little out of date. So this part doesn't demo very well, sorry. I think we can just do this. And then it's built in such a way that the actual error that got thrown gets passed to that error route. So I think you should be able to do this. Ah, shit. Come on. Okay, I straight up think the version that's on this JS bin is from like a day or two ago. But the idea is, well, actually, I have an example of it working on here. So if I go to foo bar root, And then I've got an error handler that just does a stupid message, what it calls super, so that it can like do the normal default behavior of looking for that properly named error template, and then it winds up in here. So if I actually got rid of that default behavior here, it would skip that alert message and just enter into that when I go here. So that is the magic of the sensible defaults of loading and error substates. In the end, they're just events that you can cache and do clever stuff with. And perhaps a lot of people here haven't run into too many instances where that would be useful, but it really opens up a lot of possibilities for kind of customizing all the different kind of error states and loading things that can happen in your app. So that should make it into the beta for, I think, 1.1. I'm pretty bad at the versioning route that Ember's taking, but that will be something that you can use very shortly.
So can you imagine a piece, like a progress bar that would show for each one of those loading pieces? So if you put a spinner in one, then you move on to the next one, then it'll put a spinner back on the page if you did it like that? Or could you have a progress bar that showed getting all the way to the end?
You could do any of those things.
Okay.
You could, so if you want, I mean, you can make a top level loading event handler that says put the loader on the screen.
Okay.
Don't actually transition into any loading states because you want, I guess, I don't know, the previous route that you were on to still display as templates, but like put that on the screen and then like, I don't know, configure all those child routes to like increment the value of that loader, so it's just progressively filling up more. I don't have exactly the code to do that in my mind, but it's built to support those crazy use cases.
Okay.
Ideally, there shouldn't be a whole lot that you can't do with the stuff in place, ideally. But hopefully you can get anyone here that wants to give it a shot to take a look at both the proposal that's on Discourse. Is everyone here familiar with the discuss.emberjs.com? This site here. Discourse, for those who don't know, is an Ember app, kind of built by one of the main dude behind Stack Overflow. And it's basically discuss.emberjs.com is where a lot of proposals will come in. Some people will ask questions, ask why this doesn't work that way, but a lot of the stuff that maybe the core team is working on gets kind of proposed here. We can get some feedback and what people think. So that's good place to go to see like what is being worked on, and if you got any concerns or ideas that would improve this sort of stuff. We definitely want to hear from you. So there are some examples. There's some links to the PR and to the pull request and some example JS events here if you want to see any of the stuff that I was talking about. Any other questions before moving on to the next speaker?
Just to be clear, in that example you showed where if it aired out in bar, would that mean that Woot would show a loading state or not show anything at all? That's the part I'm trying to make sure I understand.
If it entered a loading state, so I feel like I think the rule is I need to repeat all the questions. I think the question was if you're in a loading state, and then I guess Woot, the leaf route that you're trying to get into, has a promise that rejects or some other error happens,
Say in the middle of the
then what
chat,
happens?
right,
In that case, because you've, at least the way that works right now, because you have created that loading template which says do the default thing, go into this little loading substate, you will remain there. But the thing is, if you're going to be writing an app, you need to tell your app what happens when these things go wrong. So if you've got some other error event, or you've done the thing where you've defined the properly named error template, then it'll automatically transition to that error substate. Or you can do some other thing and say, oh, it's this kind of error that happened. I know to notify the server, email admin, or whatever you need to do. So it's much easier to handle that stuff now. Yeah?
Right, so just to summarize, there's 3 templates for each promise. There's pending, loading, and error. And you can,
There's no pending.
there's pending, there's pending, success, and error. Isn't pending-
Success is just you're going to continue onward to the destination route that you were originally trying to go to.
So his question was, shit, I'm doing too many years. The loading route was waiting for a pending promise to resolve.
Correct.
And then when it didn't resolve and it was an error, it still had the same. So his was, can I put a template beneath the error state? And then you said, yeah.
Yeah, basically, so
So
you're,
you-
while that, so the step is basically you get put into a loading state because some route returned a promise that didn't immediately resolve. And then some other promise that you're trying to resolve for the purpose of finishing this transition throws some error. And all that means is that you're in this loading substate and an error happened. Now do all the normal, like, looking for an error template from there, or something that responds to that error event. And based on whatever happens, whether you've defined this error template or you've defined some handler that says do all this crazy stuff when an error happens, that's how you get out of that loading state into wherever error state or whatever. Maybe you want to redirect to a login or whatever makes sense. Make a decent amount of sense. All right, I feel like we should probably
great.
move on.
Yeah.
That's great.
Cool.